Captain Marcus Reynolds had served the Royal Guard for 15 years, standing silent and watchful through countless ceremonies, state dinners, and public appearances. His black uniform bore the golden insignia of the Elite Protection Unit, a symbol he wore with immense pride. At 42, Marcus had dedicated his entire adult life to protecting the royal family, considering it the highest honor imaginable. The autumn morning started like any other at Kensington Palace. Marcus arrived at dawn, checking security protocols and briefing his team about the day's schedule. Prince George, now 12 years old, had a full agenda of educational visits and public engagements. The young prince had grown considerably since Marcus first began protecting him, transforming from a shy child into a thoughtful, young man who often surprised adults with his perceptive questions and genuine concern for others. As Marcus reviewed the security details for the morning's visit to a local children's hospital, he noticed something different in Prince George's demeanor during the breakfast briefing. The prince sat quietly at the mahogany table, his usually bright eyes seeming distant and troubled. Palace staff bustled around preparing for the day's events, but George appeared lost in his own thoughts, occasionally glancing toward the large windows overlooking the palace gardens. The drive to the hospital proceeded smoothly, with Marcus maintaining his professional vigilance while observing the young prince through the rearview mirror. George stared out the window at the London streets, watching ordinary people going about their daily lives. His small hands fidgeted with a leather notebook he always carried, filled with sketches and observations about the world around him. Marcus had often noticed the prince's habit of documenting his thoughts and experiences, finding it endearing how seriously the boy took his role and responsibilities. Upon arriving at the children's hospital, the usual crowd of photographers and well-wishers gathered behind barriers. Prince George stepped out of the vehicle with practiced grace, offering polite waves and smiles to the onlookers. However, Marcus detected a subtle change in the prince's usual enthusiasm for public appearances. Something was weighing heavily on the young royal's mind, though he maintained his composure with remarkable maturity for someone his age. The hospital staff welcomed them warmly, leading the group through spotless corridors adorned with colorful artwork created by young patients. Prince George walked alongside the chief administrator, asking thoughtful questions about the hospital's programs and services. Marcus followed at a respectful distance, constantly scanning the environment for potential security concerns while admiring the prince's genuine interest in the children's welfare. As they approached the pediatric ward, the sound of children's laughter and conversations grew louder. Prince George paused momentarily outside the ward doors, taking a deep breath before entering. Marcus noticed the prince's shoulders straighten with determination, as if preparing himself for something particularly challenging. The security captain had witnessed this same gesture many times before important speeches or difficult public appearances, but something felt different about this moment. Inside the ward, dozens of children aged between 5 and 15 occupied colorful beds and wheelchairs, their faces lighting up with excitement upon seeing the young prince. Many wore hospital gowns decorated with cartoon characters, while others had colorful bandages or medical devices that spoke to serious health challenges. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation and joy, creating a stark contrast to the underlying reality of childhood illness and suffering. Prince George began his rounds, stopping at each bed to speak with individual children and their families. Marcus watched from his position near the entrance, impressed by the prince's natural ability to connect with each child on their level. George sat on bed edges, examined drawings, listened to stories, and asked questions that showed genuine care and interest. His young face reflected empathy and compassion that seemed far beyond his years. At one particular bed, Prince George encountered a 7-year-old girl named Emma, who had been battling leukemia for over 2 years. Her bright pink headscarf covered her bald head, and despite her frail appearance, her smile radiated warmth and determination. Emma showed the prince a picture she had drawn of herself as a superhero, explaining that she wanted to help other sick children when she grew up. The conversation between the two children lasted nearly 20 minutes, far longer than the scheduled time allocation. Marcus observed the interaction with growing fascination and concern. Something profound was happening in that moment between the young prince and the brave little girl. Their conversation appeared deeply meaningful, touching on subjects far heavier than typical royal visit small talk. Emma spoke about her dreams, her fears, and her hopes for the future, while Prince George listened with an intensity that surprised even the experienced security captain. When it came time to move to the next patient, Prince George seemed reluctant to leave Emma's bedside. He promised to write her a letter and asked if she would continue drawing pictures for him. The genuine emotion in his voice caught Marcus off guard, as he had rarely seen the prince display such personal investment in an individual encounter during public appearances. The remainder of the hospital visit continued smoothly, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had occurred between the prince and young Emma. As they prepared to leave the pediatric ward, Prince George requested a private moment with the hospital's chief pediatric oncologist. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but when the prince emerged, his expression had changed completely. During the drive back to the palace, Prince George remained unusually quiet, staring out the window with a contemplative expression that seemed far too serious for a 12-year-old boy. Marcus found himself wondering what thoughts were occupying the young prince's mind, and what impact the hospital visit might have on him. Little did the security captain know that this seemingly routine engagement would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything he believed about duty, loyalty, and the true meaning of service to the crown. The following morning brought an unexpected change to the palace routine that immediately caught Marcus's attention. Prince George appeared at breakfast carrying a large cardboard box filled with his personal belongings, toys, and books. The sight puzzled the dining room staff, who exchanged confused glances as the young prince quietly began sorting through his possessions at the table. Marcus approached the prince respectfully, inquiring about the unusual activity. Prince George looked up with eyes that held a determination Marcus had never seen before, explaining that he wanted to donate his belongings to children who needed them more than he did. The security captain felt a mixture of admiration and concern, recognizing that the hospital visit had profoundly affected the young royal in ways that were only beginning to surface. Throughout the morning, Prince George continued his systematic review of his possessions, carefully examining each item before deciding its fate. Expensive toys that had been gifts from world leaders found their way into donation boxes alongside handmade crafts and cherished books. The prince's tutor, Mrs. Henderson, tried to dissuade him from giving away valuable items, but George remained resolute in his mission. Marcus watched from his post as palace staff grew increasingly uncomfortable with the prince's behavior. Senior household members whispered among themselves, clearly concerned about how the royal family would react to their son giving away costly gifts and heirloom toys. However, Prince George seemed oblivious to their concerns, focused entirely on his self-imposed task of redistributing his wealth to those he deemed more deserving. During the afternoon, Prince George requested permission to visit the palace kitchen staff, an unusual request that required Marcus to coordinate with multiple security protocols. The prince wanted to personally thank the cooks and servers for their daily service, something he had never done before. Marcus accompanied him through the busy kitchen, watching as the young royal shook hands with surprised staff members and asked about their families and working conditions. The kitchen staff, initially nervous about the unexpected royal visit, gradually warmed to Prince George's genuine interest in their lives. The head chef, Mrs. Martinez, had worked at the palace for 20 years but had never experienced such personal attention from a member of the royal family. Prince George asked detailed questions about meal preparation for large numbers of people and expressed amazement at the complexity of managing the palace's food services. During the kitchen visit, Prince George learned that several staff members had children who attended underfunded public schools, lacking basic educational resources. The information clearly disturbed the young prince, who began asking increasingly specific questions about educational inequality and childhood poverty. Marcus could see the wheels turning in George's mind as he processed this new information about societal problems he had never fully understood. That evening, Prince George approached Marcus with an unusual request. He wanted to write personal letters to every child they had met at the hospital, not just Emma. This wasn't a simple thank you note initiative, but rather a commitment to ongoing correspondence with dozens of seriously ill children. The prince had already begun drafting letters by hand, each one personalized with specific references to conversations they had shared. Marcus found himself in an unprecedented situation, trying to balance his protective duties with respect for the prince's growing social consciousness. The security protocols for handling such extensive correspondence would be complex, requiring careful screening of all incoming and outgoing communications. However, the earnestness in Prince George's voice made it impossible to simply dismiss the request as a passing childhood phase. The next few days revealed the true scope of Prince George's transformation. He began declining invitations to exclusive events and entertainment programs, preferring instead to spend time researching children's charities and social welfare organizations. His bedroom became filled with books about poverty, inequality, and social justice, materials he had requested from the palace library and local bookshops. Marcus noticed that the prince's daily routine had fundamentally shifted. Instead of the typical royal curriculum focused on languages, history, and etiquette, George now insisted on learning about contemporary social issues and humanitarian work. His tutors struggled to adapt their lesson plans to accommodate his newfound interests, unsure whether to encourage or redirect his passion for social justice. The young prince's letter-writing project expanded rapidly as he established correspondence with children from various hospitals, orphanages, and disadvantaged communities. Marcus found himself coordinating with postal services and security teams to manage the growing volume of mail. Each letter received a thoughtful, handwritten response from Prince George, who treated every piece of correspondence as critically important. Palace officials began expressing serious concerns about Prince George's behavioral changes. Some viewed his charitable interest as admirable, but worried about the intensity of his commitment and the potential security implications of extensive contact with the public. Others questioned whether such activities were appropriate for a future monarch, suggesting that charitable work should be more ceremonial and less personally involved. Marcus found himself caught between his duty to protect the prince and his growing respect for George's moral convictions. The security captain had witnessed many royal charity events over the years, but most had felt performative and superficial. Prince George's approach was different, driven by genuine empathy and a desire to make meaningful connections. With people facing hardship, the situation reached a turning point when Prince George announced his intention to use his personal allowance to purchase medical equipment for the children's hospital they had visited. The amount wasn't insignificant, representing money that had been set aside for his education and future expenses. Palace financial advisors were horrified by the proposal, arguing that such decisions required extensive consultation and approval from senior royal family members. However, Prince George remained firm in his decision, explaining that he couldn't justify keeping money for unnecessary luxuries while children lacked access to life-saving medical care. His reasoning was sound and compassionate, making it difficult for palace officials to argue against his logic without appearing callous or hypocritical. Marcus watched these discussions with growing admiration for the young prince's moral clarity and determination. As word of Prince George's charitable activities began spreading throughout the palace, Marcus sensed growing tension among the royal household. Some staff members supported the prince's humanitarian interests, while others worried about the precedent being set and the potential disruption to established royal protocols. The security captain realized that this internal conflict was only the beginning of a much larger struggle that would soon engulf everyone involved in the young prince's life. The confrontation Marcus had been dreading arrived on a cold Tuesday morning when senior palace officials requested an emergency meeting with Prince George. The conference room filled with advisors, protocol officers, and household management staff, all wearing expressions of serious concern. Marcus positioned himself near the door, maintaining his protective stance while preparing for what he suspected would be a difficult conversation. Prince William and Catherine entered the room with measured composure, their faces reflecting both parental concern and royal duty. Marcus had observed many family meetings over the years, but the tension in this particular gathering felt different and more significant. Prince George sat at the polished conference table with remarkable poise for a 12-year-old facing a room full of disapproving adults. The head of palace communications began the meeting by outlining concerns about Prince George's recent activities. The charitable correspondence, donation of personal belongings, and public statements about social inequality were creating what they termed messaging complications for the royal family. Media outlets had begun reporting on the young prince's unusual behavior, with some articles praising his compassion, while others questioned the appropriateness of his political engagement. Marcus listened carefully as various officials presented their arguments against Prince George's continued charitable activities. They cited security risks, protocol violations, and potential political complications that could arise from a young royal taking such strong positions on social issues. The discussion revealed deep-seated concerns about maintaining the royal family's carefully managed public image and avoiding controversial political entanglements. Prince George listened to each presentation with respectful attention before responding with a maturity that surprised everyone in the room. He acknowledged their concerns while explaining his belief that ignoring suffering when you have the power to help constituted a moral failure. His articulate defense of his actions drew from the letters he had received from sick children, the conversations with hospital staff, and his growing understanding of social inequality. The young prince's most powerful moment came when he read aloud from a letter he had received from Emma, the 7-year-old cancer patient. Her words described how his personal attention had given her hope during painful treatments, and how his promise to help other children had inspired her to keep fighting her illness. The room fell silent as George's voice wavered slightly while reading Emma's thanks for making her feel important and valued. Marcus watched the faces around the conference table as the emotional weight of Emma's letter sank in. Several officials shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, clearly moved by the child's words but still committed to their institutional positions. Prince William and Catherine exchanged meaningful glances, their expressions revealing internal conflict between protecting their son and supporting his compassionate instincts. The palace chaplain, who had remained quiet during the earlier discussions, finally spoke up in support of Prince George's activities. He argued that charitable work and concern for the less fortunate represented core Christian values that should be encouraged rather than suppressed. His intervention created a brief moment of hope that the meeting might reach a compromise solution. However, the head of security raised serious concerns about the extensive correspondence network Prince George had established. The volume of mail required significant resources to screen and manage, creating potential security vulnerabilities. More importantly, the personal nature of the prince's communications made it difficult to maintain appropriate boundaries between the royal family and the general public. Prince George responded to these security concerns by proposing a structured system for managing his charitable activities. He suggested working with established children's charities to create formal programs that would allow him to help disadvantaged youth while maintaining appropriate security protocols. His thoughtful approach demonstrated remarkable planning ability and genuine commitment to finding workable solutions. The discussion continued for nearly 2 hours, with various officials presenting arguments for different approaches to managing Prince George's charitable interests. Some advocated for complete cessation of his personal correspondence and donation activities, while others proposed heavily regulated alternatives that would satisfy security requirements while allowing limited charitable engagement. Throughout the meeting, Marcus found himself increasingly impressed by Prince George's poise and determination. The young prince never raised his voice or showed disrespect toward the adults challenging his activities, but he also refused to abandon his principles or the children who had come to depend on his support. His quiet strength reminded Marcus of the best qualities he had observed in military leaders during his earlier career. The turning point came when Prince George asked a simple question that silenced the room. If I can't help children who are suffering when I have the resources to make a difference, what kind of person does that make me? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everyone present, forcing them to confront the moral implications of their institutional concerns. Prince William finally broke the silence by suggesting a compromise approach that would allow Prince George to continue his charitable work through established Royal Foundation channels. This would provide appropriate oversight and security while acknowledging the legitimate value of his humanitarian interests. However, it would also significantly limit his personal involvement and direct communication with individual children. Prince George's response to his father's compromise proposal surprised everyone in the room. Rather than expressing gratitude for the concession, he politely declined the offer, explaining that bureaucratic charity work would not address the personal connections and individual attention that made his current activities meaningful. He insisted that helping people required genuine human engagement, not institutional procedures. The meeting ended without resolution, with palace officials agreeing to develop more detailed proposals for managing Prince George's charitable activities. As participants filed out of the conference room, Marcus could sense the frustration and confusion among the royal household staff. They had expected to convince a 12-year-old to abandon his charitable interests, but instead found themselves confronting a determined young man with clear moral convictions. That evening, Marcus received an unexpected summons to Prince George's private quarters. The security captain found the young prince sitting at his desk, surrounded by dozens of letters from children around the world. George looked up with tired eyes that held both determination and sadness, explaining that he had been thinking about the day's meeting and its implications for his future. Prince George asked Marcus a question that would haunt the security captain for weeks to come. "Do you think it's wrong for me to care about people who are suffering?" The simple inquiry revealed the emotional toll that the institutional pressure was taking on the young prince, who was beginning to understand that his position might require him to choose between his conscience and his royal duties. Marcus spent the night wrestling with Prince George's question, unable to find sleep as he considered the implications of the young royal's moral dilemma. The security captain had dedicated his career to protecting the royal family, but he was beginning to realize that his role might require him to protect Prince George from his own compassionate instincts. The contradiction troubled Marcus deeply, challenging his understanding of what true service to the crown actually meant. The next morning brought news that would further complicate an already difficult situation. Media outlets had obtained copies of some letters exchanged between Prince George and hospitalized children, publishing heartwarming excerpts that portrayed the young prince as remarkably caring and mature. While the coverage was largely positive, it also intensified pressure on palace officials to either embrace or curtail George's charitable activities. Prince George seemed oblivious to the media attention, continuing his daily routine of letter writing and charitable research with unwavering focus. Marcus observed the young prince during his morning correspondence session, watching as George carefully crafted personal responses to each child who had written to him. The sincerity and attention to detail in every letter demonstrated a level of commitment that impressed and concerned the security captain. During breakfast, Prince William approached Marcus for a private conversation about his son's recent behavior. The future king expressed appreciation for George's compassionate nature, while also voicing concerns about the sustainability and appropriateness of such intensive personal involvement in charitable work. Marcus found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending Prince George's activities, while acknowledging the legitimate institutional concerns. The conversation with Prince William revealed the depth of the royal family's internal conflict over George's charitable activities. While they admired their son's empathy and social consciousness, they worried about setting precedents that could create problems for future royal generations. The balance between personal conviction and institutional responsibility represented a fundamental tension within the monarchy itself. Later that morning, Marcus accompanied Prince George to a scheduled meeting with representatives from several established children's charities. Palace officials had arranged these meetings as part of their compromise proposal, hoping to channel the prince's humanitarian interests through more traditional and manageable charitable frameworks. However, Marcus could sense George's reluctance to participate in what he perceived as institutional co-opting of his personal mission. The charity representatives presented impressive statistics and program descriptions, highlighting the scope and impact of their organizational work. They offered Prince George various honorary positions and ceremonial roles that would allow him to support children's causes while maintaining appropriate distance from individual cases. Their presentations were professional and well-intentioned, but they fundamentally misunderstood what motivated the young prince's charitable work. Prince George listened politely to each presentation before explaining why their offers, while generous, didn't address his primary concern about establishing meaningful personal connections with children facing hardship. He described his correspondence with Emma and other young patients, emphasizing how individual attention and genuine care had provided hope and encouragement that institutional charity couldn't replicate. The charity officials seemed puzzled by Prince George's insistence on personal involvement, arguing that organizational approaches could help many more children than individual correspondence. Their logical arguments made perfect sense from an efficiency standpoint, but they failed to acknowledge the emotional and spiritual value of direct human connection that the prince considered essential to meaningful charitable work. Marcus watched this interaction with growing unease, recognizing that Prince George was being pressured to abandon the aspects of his charitable work that he found most meaningful and important. The adults in the room, despite their good intentions, were essentially asking a compassionate 12-year-old to become less personally invested in helping others for the sake of institutional convenience. After the charity meetings concluded, Prince George requested permission to visit Emma at the hospital, explaining that she had been undergoing particularly difficult treatments and had specifically asked to see him. Palace officials immediately began citing security concerns and protocol violations, but Marcus could see the determination in the prince's eyes that suggested he would find a way to visit Emma, regardless of official approval. The security captain found himself in an impossible position, torn between his duty to enforce palace decisions and his growing respect for Prince George's moral convictions. Marcus had sworn an oath to protect the royal family, but he was beginning to question whether that protection should extend to shielding a young prince from his own compassionate instincts and moral development. That afternoon, Marcus received a call from the hospital informing him that Emma's condition had deteriorated significantly and that her doctors weren't optimistic about her prospects for recovery. The news hit Marcus unexpectedly hard, as he had developed his own emotional investment in the brave little girl through Prince George's stories and letters. The security captain realized that he needed to inform Prince George about Emma's situation, despite knowing how devastating the news would be. Prince George's reaction to Emma's declining health was immediate and intense. He insisted on visiting the hospital despite official prohibitions, arguing that his promise to maintain contact with Emma created a moral obligation that superseded palace protocols. The young prince's determination to honor his commitment to a dying child revealed the depth of his character and the sincerity of his humanitarian convictions. Marcus found himself making a decision that would define his entire career and challenge everything he believed about duty and service. He agreed to facilitate Prince George's visit to Emma, knowing that this choice would likely violate multiple security protocols and palace directives. The security captain realized that true protection sometimes required enabling rather than restricting the person under his care. The clandestine hospital visit required careful planning and coordination, as Marcus worked to ensure Prince George's safety while avoiding detection by palace officials who had specifically forbidden the trip. The security captain felt the weight of his decision, understanding that his career and reputation were at stake, but also recognizing that some moral obligations transcended professional considerations. As they prepared for the unauthorized hospital visit, Prince George expressed gratitude to Marcus for supporting his decision to honor his commitment to Emma. The young prince's appreciation was genuine and heartfelt, but it also carried an undertone of sadness that suggested he was beginning to understand the impossible choices that his royal position would continue to present throughout his life. The drive to the hospital felt different from their previous visits, carrying emotional weight that transformed a routine security assignment into something far more significant and personal. Marcus realized that this moment represented a turning point not only for Prince George but also for himself, as he chose to prioritize human compassion over institutional compliance for the first time in his distinguished career. The unauthorized hospital visit unfolded with devastating emotional intensity that neither Marcus nor Prince George had fully anticipated. Emma lay in the intensive care unit, surrounded by complex medical equipment and loving family members who had maintained a constant vigil. Her small frame appeared even more fragile than during their previous meeting, but her eyes still held the same bright spirit that had originally captured Prince George's heart. Prince George approached Emma's bedside with remarkable composure, taking her tiny hand and speaking softly about the letters they had exchanged and the drawings she had created. Marcus positioned himself near the door, providing security while trying to maintain emotional distance from the deeply personal scene unfolding before him. However, the genuine love and care displayed between the young prince and the dying child proved impossible to ignore. Emma's parents expressed overwhelming gratitude for Prince George's visit, explaining how much his letters and attention had meant to their daughter during her darkest moments. They described how Emma had insisted on staying awake longer than her doctors recommended, determined to share one final conversation with her royal friend. The family's appreciation was genuine and heartbreaking, highlighting the profound impact that simple human kindness could have on people facing unimaginable challenges. During their conversation, Emma presented Prince George with a final drawing she had created despite her weakened condition. The artwork depicted the two of them standing together in a garden filled with flowers, representing her vision of a place where children never got sick and everyone could play together forever. Prince George's voice trembled as he thanked Emma for the beautiful gift, promising to treasure it always. Marcus watched as the young prince struggled to maintain his composure while saying goodbye to Emma, knowing that this would likely be their final meeting. The security captain had witnessed many difficult moments during his career, but the raw emotion and genuine love displayed in that hospital room affected him more deeply than any crisis or emergency he had previously faced. The conversation between Prince George and Emma lasted nearly an hour, covering topics that ranged from her hopes for other sick children to her dreams about what heaven might be like. The 12-year-old prince listened with attention and wisdom that seemed far beyond his years, offering comfort and encouragement while also allowing himself to share in Emma's sadness and fear about leaving the world behind. When it finally came time to leave, Prince George kissed Emma's forehead and promised that he would continue helping sick children in her memory. The young girl smiled weakly and asked him to remember that being kind to others was the most important thing anyone could do, regardless of their position or status in life. Her words carried wisdom that would stay with both Prince George and Marcus for the rest of their lives. The drive back to the palace occurred in complete silence, as both Prince George and Marcus processed the emotional weight of what they had just experienced. The security captain glanced in the rearview mirror to see the young prince staring out the window, with tears streaming down his face, clutching Emma's final drawing like a precious treasure that represented everything meaningful about human connection and compassion. Upon returning to the palace, Marcus immediately knew that their unauthorized visit had been discovered. Senior officials waited in the courtyard with expressions of barely controlled anger and disappointment. The security captain realized that his decision to facilitate Prince George's hospital visit would have serious consequences for his career, but he felt no regret about enabling the young prince to honor his commitment to Emma. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Palace officials expressed outrage about the security breach and protocol violations, arguing that Marcus had betrayed his professional responsibilities and endangered Prince George's safety. The security captain accepted their criticism without attempting to justify or defend his actions, understanding that institutional rules had been clearly violated regardless of the moral motivations involved. Prince George attempted to defend Marcus's decision, explaining that the visit to Emma had been his idea and that the security captain had simply honored a dying child's request for one final meeting. However, palace officials made it clear that responsibility for security decisions rested with Marcus, not with the 12-year-old prince whose judgment they considered inadequately developed for such situations. The formal disciplinary hearing occurred the following morning, with Marcus facing a panel of senior palace officials who would determine his professional future. The security captain maintained his dignity and composure throughout the proceedings, accepting responsibility for his decision while explaining the moral considerations that had influenced his choice to support Prince George's visit to Emma. During the hearing, Marcus learned that Emma had passed away peacefully during the night, just hours after Prince George's visit. The news hit the security captain like a physical blow, confirming that their unauthorized hospital trip had indeed been Emma's final opportunity to say goodbye to her royal friend. The timing made Marcus's decision feel both vindicated and heartbreaking simultaneously. Prince George was not permitted to attend the disciplinary hearing, but his influence was felt throughout the proceedings as officials struggled to balance institutional accountability with recognition of the genuine compassion that had motivated the protocol violations. The panel members clearly felt conflicted about punishing someone for facilitating an act of kindness toward a dying child. The hearing's conclusion brought Marcus's worst fears to reality as the panel announced his immediate termination from the royal guard. 15 years of distinguished service ended with a formal reprimand and removal from all palace duties. The officials expressed regret about the necessity of this action, while emphasizing that security protocols existed to protect the royal family and could not be selectively ignored regardless of circumstances. As Marcus cleared out his office and prepared to leave the palace for the final time, Prince George appeared at his door with tears in his eyes and gratitude in his voice. The young prince thanked Marcus for helping him keep his promise to Emma, and apologized for the consequences that his decision had brought upon the security captain's career. Their final conversation was brief but deeply meaningful, cementing a bond of mutual respect that transcended their former professional relationship. Prince George's reaction to Marcus's dismissal revealed the final piece of his transformation, from an obedient royal child to a young man with clear moral convictions. The 12-year-old prince declared that if showing compassion to dying children resulted in good people losing their jobs, then the royal system itself needed to be questioned and challenged. His words carried implications that would soon reshape everything about his relationship with the institution he was destined to inherit. Walking away from the palace for the last time, Marcus felt simultaneously devastated and proud of his final act of service to the royal family. He had lost his career and professional reputation, but he had enabled a young prince to honor his commitment to a dying child and learn valuable lessons about moral courage in the face of institutional pressure. 3 months after Marcus's departure from the royal guard, Prince George's behavior had evolved into something that palace officials could only describe as quiet rebellion. The young prince continued his charitable correspondence and donation activities, despite repeated attempts to redirect his attention toward more traditional royal pursuits. His determination had only strengthened following Emma's death and Marcus's dismissal, creating an atmosphere of tension that permeated every level of the royal household. The new security captain assigned to protect Prince George found himself dealing with a fundamentally different child than the one Marcus had described in his handover notes. Prince George remained polite and respectful, but had developed a subtle defiance that made managing his activities increasingly challenging. The young prince seemed to view every security restriction as an attempt to prevent him from helping others, leading to creative workarounds that tested the patience of his protective detail. Palace officials discovered that Prince George had been using his computer and phone access to research methods for establishing charitable foundations and youth advocacy organizations. His browsing history revealed extensive investigation into legal frameworks that would allow him to pursue humanitarian work independently of royal family oversight. The sophistication of his research surprised adults who had underestimated the 12-year-old's determination and intelligence. During this period, Prince George received hundreds of letters from children around the world who had learned about his charitable activities through media coverage. Many writers shared stories of illness, poverty, and hardship that would have overwhelmed most adults. But the young prince insisted on personally reading and responding to each piece of correspondence. His commitment to individual attention had grown into something approaching a personal mission. The emotional toll of processing so much childhood suffering began affecting Prince George's health and academic performance. Teachers reported that he appeared tired and distracted during lessons, often staring out windows with a distant expression that suggested his mind was occupied with weightier matters than traditional royal curriculum subjects. His parents grew increasingly concerned about their son's well-being, while remaining uncertain about how to address his humanitarian obsessions. Palace physicians recommended reducing Prince George's correspondence activities and charitable research, arguing that excessive exposure to childhood suffering was inappropriate for someone his age. However, the young prince refused to abandon the children who had come to depend on his letters and support. He argued that their suffering was real regardless of his age, and that ignoring their pain for his own comfort would be morally inexcusable. The situation reached a critical point when Prince George announced his intention to establish a charitable foundation using his personal trust fund money. Legal advisors explained that such action would require extensive consultation and approval from multiple royal family members and government officials. The complex bureaucratic requirements were clearly designed to discourage the young prince from pursuing independent, charitable work, but they only strengthened his resolve to find alternative approaches. Media attention surrounding Prince George's charitable activities continued intensifying, with newspapers and television programs portraying him as either a remarkably compassionate young royal or a misguided child being exploited by adult agendas. The conflicting narratives created additional pressure on the royal family to either embrace or curtail their son's humanitarian interests, while Prince George himself remained focused on helping individual children, regardless of public opinion. During this turbulent period, Prince George received an unexpected visitor who would profoundly influence his understanding of service and duty. Marcus Reynolds arrived at the palace in civilian clothes, having requested a private meeting to discuss the young prince's future and the lessons learned from their shared experiences. Palace officials reluctantly agreed to the meeting, hoping that Marcus might convince Prince George to moderate his charitable activities. The reunion between Prince George and Marcus was emotionally charged, with both individuals having grown and changed significantly during their months apart. The former security captain had spent his time reflecting on the meaning of true service and the importance of moral courage in the face of institutional pressure. Prince George had continued developing his humanitarian convictions while struggling with the constraints imposed by his royal position. Marcus shared with Prince George his conclusion that genuine service sometimes required challenging established systems and protocols when they conflicted with fundamental human values. The former security captain explained that his career sacrifice had been worthwhile because it enabled the young prince to honor his commitment to Emma and learn valuable lessons about moral courage that would serve him throughout his life as a future monarch. Prince George listened intently to Marcus's wisdom about balancing institutional loyalty with personal conscience, recognizing that the former security captain had wrestled with many of the same dilemmas that now confronted the young royal. Their conversation covered topics ranging from the nature of true leadership to the responsibility that privilege creates for helping those less fortunate than oneself. The most significant moment of their meeting came when Marcus presented Prince George with a letter he had received from Emma's parents, thanking both of them for bringing joy and hope to their daughter's final days. The family had established a small memorial fund in Emma's name and requested that Prince George serve as its honorary patron, a role that would allow him to continue helping sick children while honoring his friend's memory. Marcus advised Prince George that effective humanitarian work required strategic thinking and patience, encouraging the young prince to view his current constraints as temporary obstacles rather than permanent barriers to meaningful service. The former security captain suggested that Prince George focus on developing his knowledge and skills while maintaining his compassionate convictions, preparing for a future when he would have greater freedom to implement his humanitarian vision. Their conversation concluded with Marcus offering to serve as an unofficial advisor for Prince George's charitable interests, providing guidance and support outside the formal palace structure. The former security captain explained that his dismissal had actually freed him to offer more honest counsel, as he no longer faced conflicting loyalties between institutional requirements and the young prince's moral development. As Marcus prepared to leave the palace for the second time, Prince George made a decision that would reshape his approach to royal duty and charitable work. The young prince announced that he would temporarily reduce his correspondence activities and charitable research, not in submission to palace pressure, but as part of a strategic plan to better prepare himself for more effective humanitarian work in the future. The compromise represented a mature understanding that sustainable change required careful planning and institutional navigation rather than direct confrontation. Prince George had learned from Marcus's experience that moral courage sometimes manifested as strategic patience rather than immediate action, and that effective leadership required balancing idealistic convictions with practical wisdom about achieving meaningful results within existing systems. 5 years later, the world witnessed the emergence of a young Prince George whose humanitarian work had evolved into something far more sophisticated and impactful than anyone could have imagined during his childhood crisis of conscience. At 17, the prince had successfully established multiple charitable initiatives that operated within royal family frameworks, while maintaining the personal touch and genuine compassion that had originally motivated his activism. The Emma Henderson Foundation, named in honor of his deceased friend, had grown into one of Europe's most effective children's medical charities. Prince George served as its patron and primary fundraiser, using his royal platform to attract global attention and resources for pediatric healthcare initiatives. The Foundation's unique approach combined institutional efficiency with the personal attention to individual children that the prince had always considered essential to meaningful charitable work. Marcus Reynolds had become the Foundation's security director and strategic advisor, bringing his military background and intimate understanding of royal protocols to ensure the organization's success while protecting Prince George's safety. The former security captain's career sacrifice had ultimately led to a more fulfilling role where his loyalty and dedication could serve humanitarian purposes, rather than simply maintaining institutional status quo. The relationship between Prince George and Marcus had evolved into something approaching a partnership between mentor and student, with both individuals having learned valuable lessons about the nature of service, duty, and moral courage. Their shared experience of choosing compassion over institutional compliance had created a bond that transcended their former professional relationship and provided a foundation for their continued collaborative work. Palace officials had gradually come to appreciate Prince George's strategic approach to charitable work, recognizing that his humanitarian activities actually enhanced the royal family's reputation and public standing. The prince had successfully demonstrated that meaningful charitable engagement could coexist with royal duties when properly managed and thoughtfully implemented. His mature handling of media attention and public expectations had impressed even his harshest critics. Within the royal household, the personal correspondence network that had initially caused such institutional concern had evolved into a structured mentorship program connecting Prince George with young people facing various challenges. The program provided carefully managed opportunities for meaningful interaction while maintaining appropriate security and privacy protections. Hundreds of children had benefited from the prince's personal attention and encouragement over the years. Prince George's transformation from a compassionate but naive 12-year-old into a sophisticated humanitarian leader reflected lessons learned during his childhood confrontation with institutional authority. He had discovered that effective change required patience, strategy, and collaboration, rather than direct rebellion against established systems. His approach balanced idealistic convictions with practical wisdom about achieving meaningful results within existing frameworks. The annual Emma Henderson Foundation Gala had become one of London's most prestigious charitable events, attracting international celebrities, business leaders, and government officials who contributed millions of pounds to pediatric healthcare initiatives. Prince George personally attended every event, ensuring that the focus remained on helping sick children rather than social networking or political positioning. His authentic commitment to the cause was evident to everyone who interacted with him. During one particularly moving gala speech, Prince George shared the story of his friendship with Emma and the lessons he had learned about the importance of treating every child as valuable and deserving of attention. He credited Marcus Reynolds with teaching him that true service sometimes required challenging established procedures when they conflicted with fundamental human values. The audience responded with a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Marcus watched from the security position as Prince George delivered his speech, remembering the confused and determined 12-year-old who had risked institutional disapproval to visit a dying child. The former security captain felt enormous pride in the young man's growth and development, knowing that his career sacrifice had contributed to nurturing a future monarch who understood the real meaning of leadership and service. The Foundation's medical research programs had funded breakthrough treatments for childhood cancers and rare diseases, directly saving thousands of young lives around the world. Prince George insisted on meeting many of the children who had benefited from Foundation-supported treatments, maintaining the personal connection approach that had always been central to his charitable philosophy. These meetings provided emotional fuel for his continued humanitarian work. Educational initiatives sponsored by the Foundation had established scholarship programs and learning centers in underserved communities, ensuring that children facing health challenges could also access quality education. Prince George's vision had expanded beyond medical care to encompass the broader social factors that affected children's well-being and life opportunities. His comprehensive approach impressed social policy experts and government officials. The prince's influence had also extended to his younger siblings, who had developed their own charitable interests inspired by their brother's example. The entire royal family had gradually embraced more hands-on approaches to humanitarian work, creating a new model for royal service that emphasized genuine engagement rather than ceremonial participation. Prince George's childhood rebellion had ultimately transformed the institution from within. As he stood in his security position during another successful foundation event, Marcus reflected on the profound changes that had resulted from a 12-year-old's simple decision to care about suffering children. The former Royal Guard's resignation had initially felt like a career-ending defeat, but it had actually opened the door to more meaningful service than he had ever imagined possible during his years protecting the royal family. Prince George approached Marcus during a quiet moment at the gala, expressing gratitude for the older man's continued guidance and friendship. The young prince acknowledged that their shared experience of choosing moral courage over institutional compliance had shaped his understanding of true leadership and service. Their conversation was brief but meaningful, reflecting the deep mutual respect that had grown between them over the years. The evening concluded with Prince George reading a letter from a young girl currently receiving treatment at the same hospital where he had first met Emma. The child thanked the prince for his foundation's support and expressed hope that she would someday help other sick children just as he had helped her. The letter represented the continuation of a cycle of compassion that had begun with a dying girl's simple request for attention and kindness. As guests departed from the gala, Marcus knew that his decision to resign from the Royal Guard in support of Prince George's moral convictions had been vindicated by years of meaningful humanitarian work that had touched thousands of lives. The former security captain had discovered that true service sometimes required leaving official positions to pursue higher purposes that transcended institutional boundaries and bureaucratic limitations.